Hello, my name is Marco Tizza. This is debate 4 on the environment. I will be defending how environmental considerations must take precedent over economic developmental considerations. When we take climate change into considerations, one of the key factors and one of the largest things to take into consideration is, of course, global warming. As humans, we have been extremely wasteful as well as very inefficient with some of our finite resources. For example, coal is actually enjoying one of its biggest renaissances in the history of economics. In the 1990s, many countries substituted coal with gas, but this trend has since been reversed since coal has become incredibly competitive. This is according to Deputy Director and Head Economics at Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact and Research. Climate change has been a major issue for decades at this point, and Americans have expressed their interest and feelings on this issue before. Um, the first time they actually did this was in Gallup's polling history in 1985. They actually asked Americans about the trade-off between environmental protection and economic growth, and at that point in time, over 60% of them actually chose the environmental option. So I think it's safe to say that Americans have a strong interest in protecting the environment. But to go on, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, has actually warned that the continued warming of the planet without major reductions in emissions would see a rise in global sea levels somewhere between 2 and 3 feet. And it seems obvious that we should take into consideration the opinions and statements of the world's leading climate scientists. Uh, they obviously have a better knowledge and understanding of what is happening in the major polar ice caps in Greenland, as well as both in West and East Antarctica. Um, let's see. Some of the lead scientists with the IPCC have actually warned that there's only about 12 years for global warming to keep a maximum of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and anything beyond that, even of a half a degree, would significantly worsen the risks of droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty for hundreds of millions of people. They actually went on to calculate that if global temperatures increased somewhere between 4 and 5 Celsius, that the world would lose an area of land equal to 1.7 million square kilometers, is equivalent to the size of Libya, and that's all simply because of rising sea levels. Now, I don't necessarily read that to mean that if we don't immediately take some ridiculous action within the next 12 years, that eventually temperatures will rise more than 1.5 degrees, and eventually things will be catastrophic in 12 years. Um, what I think it is more simply put is that ensuring global temperatures are stabilizing and don't reach more than 1.5 degrees needs to be an absolute priority when considering over developmental and economic projects. Now, this doesn't mean the world necessarily is going to end. It also does not mean that the world is going to be an impossible place for civilizations to continue to exist like it does now. What it does mean, however, is that there would be lots of costly impacts, much like sea level rise in nearby coastal cities, as well as saltwater intrusion into freshwater aquifers, and even more powerful storms and hurricanes than we've already seen. And as usual, this is going to be affecting the poorest countries and some of the poorest people in the world, who it's going to affect first and by far the most. Underdeveloped countries do not have the resources to improve their nation after a natural disaster, or they're already living on the edge, so any serious level in sea rise could wipe out civilizations. It could kill thousands, millions of people. So these are problems that are not going to be outside the scope of our lifetimes. It won't just be something simple as sea level rise. There's going to be millions and millions of people displaced. And that's not only due to sea level rise, which will more than likely occur later. Um, More importantly, just for the global impact, the changing weather patterns will make an inhabited area unsuitable for farming. And this has already been seen in places like Indochina due to changing monsoon patterns. It's safe to assume that it would be seen elsewhere along the world as well. Climate change is going to be displacing enough people to create a refugee crisis, with the likes of which we have frankly never seen before, like of this size in humanity. So ignoring wars that are obviously going to follow this massive displacement is just not the right idea. Um, I think if you honestly think there's not going to be change, then quite frankly, just have no place in the argument. From a global perspective, I think it's very obvious, however, that 0% economic growth is just not a serious option. A global climate agreement would have to be agreed upon. However, that would lead to a reduction of coal and oil consumption. However, I think that would constitute a problem for a lot of countries that are dependent on large fossil fuel resources. It would probably cause a lot of huge disparities between Africa and European countries, as well as South American countries that just would not be acceptable. No one necessarily wants to stop economic growth. That would obviously give people millions of better lives. But we simply must insist on a sustainable development that combines environmental care as well as social justice and economic growth. Uh, the earth has its limited resources and it cannot support unrestricted growth. Unchecked population growth has actually been known to have a negative impact on any nation as well as the whole entire planet. Both poverty and environmental problems of like sub-Saharan African countries are largely the result of rapid population growth and pressure on limited resources. And at the same time, you see countries like China become wealthy while following a one child per couple policy. So limiting population growth would have a result in a higher standard of living and will preserve the environment, if you would say. Climate change is obviously going to displace enough people for there to be a refugee crisis that the likes of which we just cannot ignore. So I think this obvious displacement and with the changes in environment, much like in the future, it would be foolish to avoid them.